You wake up in a cold stone room, wrists tied in rawhide. You're not alone. A man in animal skins crouches over your head with a jagged rock. There's no anesthesia, no explanation, just the sound of scraping. He's drilling into your skull and everyone around you is chanting like, "This is normal." There's blood pressure, a sickening crack, and then silence. Her name was Kaya, 12 winters old. Dark hair, matted with river clay, eyes too big for her thin face. When the shaking started, no one understood. Her limbs would twist and spasm. Her mouth would fill with foam. The elders said she was touched by something dark, a sky spirit, that had burrowed into her skull and made a nest in her brain. She wasn't the first in the village to be cursed, but she was the youngest, and that made her dangerous. Her mother, Ina, begged for mercy, but mercy didn't exist in a place like this. The only cure, the shaman said, was to open the head and let the spirit fly out. His name was Dren, old bent, like a crooked tree, with fingers yellowed from smoke and herbs. His face was smeared with ash, his eyes milk-white with blindness, but his hands were steady. He had done this before. 3 times. 2 had survived. 1 had not. Kaya didn't understand what was happening when they laid her on the flat rock beside the fire pit. Stars above blinked cold and pitiless. Her wrists were bound. Her feet too. She didn't scream. She just asked for her mother. Ina wasn't allowed to answer. The ritual began with smoke. Crushed herbs burned in carved bowls, sage pine, needles, moldy bark. The villagers chanted softly, pressing palms to their foreheads. Dren approached, holding a sharpened obsidian shard wrapped in deer gut. He raised it to the sky, muttered something in a forgotten tongue, and knelt beside the child. Her eyes were wide, frozen. No one covered them. Dren made the first cut slowly, a half moon across her scalp. Blood welled instantly, thick and dark. He wiped it away with moss. Another cut, another line. Then he peeled back the skin, revealing the pale curve of Kaya's skull. She whimpered, but her body was rigid, held tight by the ropes and fear. He tapped gently, searching for the softest spot. Found it near the temple, and then the scraping began. It wasn't fast, it wasn't clean. The shard of stone wasn't meant for precision, it was meant for persistence. Each circle took minutes, gouging through layers of bone like a snail burrowing into limestone. Blood ran down her cheeks, pooled in her ears. Her teeth clenched. Her eyes rolled back. The chanting grew louder. Dren never hesitated, not once. He scraped, 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 until suddenly, crack, a pop dot, and a soft hiss of air. The hole was complete. Everyone held their breath. Dren reached for a small wooden funnel, carved generations ago, stained with time and rituals long forgotten. Placed it against the wound, lifted a hollowed gourd filled with heated water, and began to pour. Steam curled into the air, carrying with it the scent of burning herbs and blood. Kaya twitched once, then again, and then stillness. No one spoke for a long time. The chanting stopped. Even the fire seemed to dim. Dren pressed a thick wad of moss over the hole and tied a strip of rabbit hide to hold it in place. Then, without a word, he stood and walked away. Kaya's chest rose and fell. She was alive. For now Ina was finally allowed to approach. She knelt beside her daughter, trembling, brushing the blood from her brow. Kaya didn't respond. Her eyes were open, but blank, staring not at her mother, but through her, into some place no one else could see. That night, the stars burned a little brighter. The spirits had been appeased. The hole in Kaya's skull had released the sickness, or, so they said. But 3 days later, she began to scream. Long, terrible screams, at nothing, at everything. She clawed at her head, tearing the bandages, blood soaking the moss. Her eyes swelled shut. Her body convulsed again. The spirit hadn't left. It had burrowed deeper. They carried her into the river on the 4th day. The water swallowed the sound. When the ripples faded, the village returned to silence. Dren never performed the ritual. Again, centuries passed. The bones remained. We've found them, scattered across the globe. In Peru, France, Siberia, Ethiopia. All with the same haunting evidence. A clean hole bored through the skull, surrounded by signs of healing. That's the most disturbing part. They survived. Many of them. Which means it wasn't madness, it was medicine. The best they had. In the 1600s, European physicians rediscovered trepanation. This time, it wasn't for demons. It was for head trauma, pressure relief, bleeding, fevers, migraines. A man named Nicholas Tulp once described opening a child's skull to drain the corrupted fluids of the brain. The child lived. Others did in single quotes too. By the 1800s, battlefield doctors used trepanation to relieve pressure from musket wounds. No anesthesia. No sterile tools. Just brute force and hope. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it left soldiers half alive, groaning in fever dreams until they welcomed death. The method changed. The thinking didn't. A hole in the head, it was. Always about letting something out. Or sometimes, letting something in. There are modern people who still do it today. Not as doctors, as believers. Trepanation has found its way into the world of biohackers and fringe thinkers. They claim it increases consciousness, expands awareness, unlocks the brain's full potential. They cut into their skulls with hand drills, kitchen tools, power saws. They post the videos online. But in the end, whether it's Kaya in a cave or a YouTuber in a bathroom mirror, the desire is the same. A need to fix what's broken inside the mind, to reach the unreachable. Sometimes, that journey starts with a hole in the head. But what if the cure was worse than the illness? What if the treatment didn't just fail? What if it scarred humanity for centuries? Because, as we'll see next, some doctors didn't just bore holes into skulls. They electrocuted the brain. The year is 1786. London smells of soot and slaughter. And somewhere in the back of a butcher's shop, a scientist is wiring a frog's leg to a copper rod. London, 1786. The fog hangs low over the cobbled streets like a dirty shroud. Coal smoke mingles with the smell of rotting fish, damp wood, and horse dung. The city groans beneath the weight of its own invention. Factories churn out steam and soot. Men in top hats step over orphans in the street. But in a small room behind a butcher's shop on Fleet Street, a different kind of experiment is unfolding. one that will bridge life and death, one that begins not with blood, but with a twitch. Luigi Galvani never set foot in London. He worked in Bologna with frogs, not as food, but as vessels. In 1780, he noticed something strange. A dead frog's leg, dangling from a copper hook, twitched violently when touched by metal during a lightning storm. At first, he thought it was the work of divine life energy. He called it animal electricity. But the truth was more disturbing. The spark wasn't coming from the heavens. It was coming from the body itself. Soon, doctors, scientists, and charlatans across Europe became obsessed. What if this electricity wasn't just a reaction? What if it was resurrection? Enter Giovanni Aldini Galvani's nephew, and the true showman of this dark scientific theater. Unlike his uncle, Aldini wasn't content with frogs. He wanted something bigger, human, and the perfect place to find one was in the gallows, in January 1803. A man named George Foster was hanged for murdering his wife and child, Grays. His body was still warm when Aldini acquired it. With a crowd of medical students, aristocrats, and horrified onlookers, Aldini carried the corpse into the Royal College of Surgeons. He set the dead man on a slab of metal, rolled up his sleeves, and attached electrodes to the lifeless body. He turned on the current. The effect was immediate. The corpse convulsed. The mouth twitched into a sneer. One eye flew open. When Aldini connected wires to the ears and rectum, the entire body arched violently off the table. The dead man's fists clenched. His chest heaved as if he were about to scream. A woman in the crowd fainted. Some swore they saw him breathe. But George Foster wasn't alive. He was a puppet. Aldini believed the electricity didn't just reanimate muscle, it touched the very soul. He became obsessed with its possibilities. In Paris, he treated patients suffering from severe depression by running currents through their heads. Some were soothed. Others were shattered. He claimed victory regardless. But beneath the marble columns and elegant lecture halls, people began to whisper. Was this medicine or necromancy? By the 19th century, the idea had evolved into something even more brutal, electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. But this wasn't the modern version, refined and controlled. This was the early 1900s, when voltage meant violence. When patients were strapped to gurneys and shocked until their limbs flailed like dying birds. No muscle relaxants, no anesthesia, just the smell of burning hair and the echo of screams down linoleum corridors. It was a treatment, they said. For what? Depression, schizophrenia, hysteria, homosexuality, anything that didn't fit into polite society. If your mind betrayed you, electricity would discipline it. One woman, Mary Delacourt, committed in 1927 for melancholia and episodes of defiant speech, was shocked twice a week for 4 months. After each session, she couldn't remember her own name. She forgot the face of her son. Her vocabulary shrank to simple nouns. Spoon, chair, pain. That was progress, the doctor said. She was finally calm. The horror wasn't just in the act, it was in the silence afterward. Blank faces, drooling mouths, minds erased like chalkboards, wiped clean by invisible lightning. The horror wasn't just in the act, it was in the silence afterward. Blank faces, drooling mouths, minds erased like chalkboards, wiped clean by invisible lightning. Hospitals embraced it. Insurance covered it. And it wasn't confined to adults. In one institution outside Boston, 13-year-old boys were shocked for wetting the bed. Girls as young as 9 were restrained and jolted for tantrums. It became a tool not just for treatment, but for control. But the most chilling part of the electric cure wasn't what it did to the body, it was what it did to the soul. There's a theory that every shock fractures the self-splitting memory. From meaning, feeling from thought. That each surge leaves behind a ghost. Not one that haunts the room, but one that stares from behind the patient's own eyes. Silent, lost, waiting to remember who they were. In 1938, 2 Italian doctors, Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini, refined the technique into a procedure still used today. They tested it first on pigs. The convulsions were violent, but the animals survived. Then they tried it on people. The first subject was a man found wandering the train station in Rome. He didn't speak, didn't know his name. They strapped him down, attached electrodes to his temples, and administered the shock. He screamed after the first jolt. After the second, he began to weep. After the third, he said his name. The doctors hailed it as a miracle. But no one asked him what else he lost. By mid-century, Iket had become a symbol of psychiatric power. In movies, it was the climax of cruelty. In real life, it was the beginning of compliance. Marriages used it to correct defiant wives. Parents used it to punish children who wouldn't conform. And doctors used it to flatten the peaks of every unruly mind. Not every story ended in ruin. Some patients reported relief like clouds lifting. Others described the afterglow as euphoric. The brain rebooted, they said. Thoughts realigned. Pain receded. But for every success, there was another Mary Delacourt, a mind reduced to rubble. A person who had once dreamed, now staring at a wall, tracing cracks that never moved. Today ECT still exists. It's safer, gentler, cloaked in sterile rooms and whispered conversations. But the legacy remains a voltage that once made corpses dance and minds forget. The body is a machine, they said, and electricity is the key. But if a man can make a corpse move with wires and voltage, does that make him a doctor or a god? The line between healing and horror has always been thin, and we haven't even reached the worst of it. Because while some doctors were electrifying brains, others were cutting into them. Literally, they called it a lobotomy, a miracle, a breakthrough, a small tap to the eye socket. And your mind would never be the same. It began with a whisper in the dark corridors of mental asylums, a promise that salvation could be found not through love or understanding, but through incision. That madness could be cut out like a tumor. That pain had a switch in the brain, and that a steady hand could turn it off. The year was 1935. Antonio Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurologist, stood over the exposed skull of a woman whose mind had betrayed her. She was violent, suicidal, paranoid, labeled incurable by the standards of the time, means elegant in his white coat and chain-smoking cigarettes. believed the key to healing her didn't lie in therapy or medicine. It lay deeper inside her frontal lobes, means injected pure alcohol into the white matter of her brain, destroying the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of her mind. The result: she became calmer, quieter, less herself, but more manageable. He called it a leucotomy. It would later be renamed the lobotomy. What Minas had done was not science, it was butchery masquerading as brilliance. And yet, the medical world applauded him. He received the Nobel Prize in 1949, not for discovering a cure but for finding a convenient one. Across the ocean, in America, a man named Dr. Walter Freeman watched from the sidelines. Freeman was not a surgeon. He was a neurologist, but he was captivated by Moness's discovery and obsessed with improving it. Freeman wanted to bring the lobotomy out of the operating room and into every hospital, every clinic, every living room, if possible. He believed the mind was a machine. When it jammed, it needed a mechanic. He would be that mechanic. But Freeman didn't want to drill into skulls. He wanted something faster, cleaner, portable. So he took an ice pick from his kitchen drawer, walked into his office, and began testing. What emerged would become one of the most grotesque procedures in medical history: the transorbital lobotomy. It required no anesthesia, just a local shock, usually from electroconvulsive therapy, to make the patient unconscious for a moment. Then, with a practiced thrust, Freeman would slide the pick-like instrument through the tear duct above the eyeball, crush the bone behind it, and insert the tool directly into the frontal lobe. With a small, sweeping motion like stirring soup, would sever the fibers that connected the frontal cortex to the emotional centers of the brain. The patient would twitch, sometimes moan, sometimes scream. Then it was done. 10 minutes, tops. Freeman called it surgery of the soul. He believed it cured everything: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, postpartum sadness, even disobedience. No matter what troubled you, the answer was in your head. And the cure was his hand. He toured the country in a van he called the lobotomobile. He performed thousands of lobotomies, sometimes in hospital corridors, sometimes in offices. Once, in front of a crowd of interns, he performed 2 lobotomies, simultaneously using both hands. He lobotomized housewives who cried too much, children who didn't sit still, veterans who had nightmares. He lobotomized Rosemary Kennedy's to the future president, because she was deemed moodily rebellious. She emerged from the surgery a hollowed-out girl who could barely speak. She spent the rest of her life in an institution. Freeman claimed success. He kept scrapbooks of thank you letters from families, but he also kept photos of his patients, before and after surgery, smiling, slack-jawed, lost. The horror wasn't in the gore. There was little blood. The horror was in what was lost. Before the lobotomy, a man might rage against his confinement, scream about invisible enemies, curse the ceiling. Afterward, he would sit in silence, blinking at the wall. Not healed, just quiet. Freeman believed that meant the disease was gone. But others began to wonder, what if he hadn't removed the sickness? What if he had simply erased the person? Critics spoke up, but Freeman was untouchable until one day. He killed a patient, It was 1967. A woman named Helen Mortensen, who had undergone 2 previous lobotomies, came back for a third. Freeman performed the surgery. She died of a brain hemorrhage. Finally, the tide turned. Hospitals stopped offering lobotomies. Freeman was banned from operating. He retired, his name tainted. He died in 1972, still insisting he had helped thousands in total. More than 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States, countless more around the world. Many of the victims were never violent, never dangerous, They were simply inconvenient. A boy who couldn't concentrate. A girl who asked too many questions. A mother overwhelmed with grief. A soldier with too many memories. They came to doctors seeking help, and they were turned into ghosts. The true tragedy was not the cold steel in the brain, but the warm consent of society. Doctors signed the orders. Families begged for the procedures. Newspapers hailed them as miracles. No one asked what was being lost. In sanatoriums across Europe and the Americas. Those suffering from tuberculosis were confined for months, sometimes years, under the doctrine of rest and fresh air. These places, often beautiful on the outside, hid a slow decay within. Patients were kept from speaking, from walking, from writing too much. Anything that might excite the lungs was forbidden. Some were so still for so long they forgot how to walk. One woman, Liesl Moorer, wrote in her journal, hidden beneath a loose tile, that the worst part was not the coughing, nor the bleeding, nor even the deaths. It was the sound of her own voice fading from memory. By the time she left the sanatorium, cured in body, her words came out broken, like someone learning to speak again. In all of these treatments, there was a common thread, the belief that pain could be progress, that the body could be corrected with enough force, that suffering was part of salvation. And now, in the calm of the present, we ask how such things could have happened. But the truth is, they didn't happen in shadows. They happened in hospitals, in schools, in churches. They were signed off by governments, funded by donors, applauded by communities. The cruelty wore a white coat. And so it passed through history not as horror, but as healing. Today, we tell ourselves we are wiser. We speak of ethics and consent. We question authority. But even now, in whispers and dark corners, echoes remain. In forced medical procedures, in experiments on the poor, in trials that forget the people behind the numbers. History, after all, does not repeat itself, it waits. And sometimes, it dresses itself as progress. In the end, what remains is not just the scarred bodies or the pages of forgotten medical ledgers, but the silence of those who were never asked if they consented. The silence of mothers who woke up sterilized. The silence of children who cried for help in asylums and were given only restraints in return. The silence of men whose minds were taken by lobotomies, and the women who were told their sanity could be removed with a scalpel. History is not just the stories we tell, but also the ones we buried under the polite language of treatment, progress, and healing. For every grotesque cure, there was a patient, a human being whose fear was real, whose voice was muffled, and whose pain was often regarded as necessary collateral. By the mid-20th century, the facade began to crack. The optimism of early medicine gave way to reckoning. Advances in science exposed how wrong the old remedies were. Microscopes revealed bacteria, not bad blood. Psychology uncovered trauma, not hysteria. Antibiotics changed the entire landscape of disease. But even as knowledge expanded, some of the most invasive, soul-crushing practices clung on longer than anyone expected, because they were never just medical. They were social, political, deeply cultural. Medicine, after all, is not immune to bias. It reflects the era it's born into. And in every era, there are people who society finds inconvenient. Take the story of John Wexley, a teenager from Pennsylvania in the 1950s. John was diagnosed as emotionally disturbed after his father died, and he began acting out in school. Rather than grief counseling or therapy, he was sent to a state hospital where he underwent insulin shock therapy. Every day, for weeks, he was injected with massive doses of insulin to induce seizures and comas. The idea was that these seizures would reset his brain like rebooting a machine the first time it happened. He remembered convulsing so hard he bit halfway through his tongue. The second time, he blacked out completely and awoke with no memory of his name. He was 14. After the 8th session, he began losing motor control. After the 10th, he stopped speaking altogether. It was not therapy. It was erasure. Quiet. When his mother finally pulled him out, he couldn't remember who she was. Decades later, when John was an old man, he sat in a park, watching other children play. He told a nurse, who sat beside him, "I think I used to know that feeling, the freedom of being a child. But I lost it in a white room." His story never made headlines. No one was punished. The hospital had long since closed. The records sealed. The theme repeats itself again and again. Children and the vulnerable suffering in silence, while experts, often convinced of their own righteousness, kept pressing forward in the name of science. For every remedy that aimed to heal, there were others that sought control, to quiet the loud, to tame the wild, to sanitize the human condition itself. And yet, for all the horror, there were moments quiet, defiant moments where dignity survived. In 1943, inside the walls of a grim asylum in Czechoslovakia, a woman named Magda was scheduled for a lobotomy. Diagnosed as dangerously melancholic, she had attempted suicide after losing her son in a bombing raid. Her cries were considered disruptive, her refusal to eat an act of rebellion. So the doctors scheduled the procedure, convinced that severing parts of her frontal lobe would calm her spirit. But Magda refused to scream. On the day of the operation, she managed to whisper to the attending nurse, "Please don't let them take my mind. It's all I have left." The nurse paused. Tin did something unthinkable. She pulled Magda from the schedule, falsified records, and snuck her out 2 nights later under cover of chaos as the facility was evacuated during an air raid. They were never seen again. Some say they made it to Switzerland. Others say they died in the woods trying. But the nurse's logbook, found years later, contained a single scribbled line across the date of the surgery. "Her mind matters more than their comfort," stands like a monument in the face of 1,000 forgotten patients. As the 20th century drew to a close, investigations finally began to lift the veil. Truth commissions, in countries like Canada and Australia uncovered decades of forced medical procedures on Indigenous people. Survivors of sterilization campaigns began to tell their stories, some for the first time, their voices cracking not with age, but with the memory of being voiceless. Class action lawsuits were filed, apologies issued, policies rewritten, but even the most earnest regret could never restore what was taken. In Sweden, one woman named Birgit stood before Parliament in 1999, holding the medical form that authorized her sterilization when she was 17. She read it aloud, hands shaking. Subject is not considered socially or mentally capable of motherhood. Consent waived. She paused, tears catching in her throat, then added, "I would have been a good mother. I would have sung lullabies." Her words echoed long after the chamber went silent. These stories don't just belong to the past. In many parts of the world, outdated and harmful medical practices continue under different names. In refugee camps, in prisons, in the cracks of systems not built to protect. The methods may change, the language may soften, but the danger remains. Whenever medicine forgets the person behind the patient, it begins to lose its soul. And yet, history doesn't only offer warnings, it offers wisdom. From these scars have emerged reforms, ethical standards, and a new generation of physicians determined to put compassion at the heart of care. Medical students now learn not just anatomy and pharmacology, but also how to listen, how to recognize bias, how to see the whole person. A young doctor named Samir, training in Berlin, once read about the old hysteria treatments and wept, not out of guilt, he hadn't done them, but out of grief. They forgot to ask, he said. They forgot to ask what the patient needed, and they thought they knew better. His supervisor nodded and told him something he never forgot. Arrogance is the oldest disease in medicine. Humility is the only cure. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a challenge to remember the countless unnamed patients whose stories were never recorded, whose pain was never honored, whose suffering was folded into the pages of medical journals as mere side effects or footnotes. 2. Remember the children whose cries were misunderstood as madness, the women whose strength was punished as illness, the men who were broken in the name of normalcy. To remember not to repeat the same mistakes just because they come with new labels. It also leaves us with gratitude. Gratitude that medicine has evolved, that there are now treatments based on science, not superstition, that pain is no longer seen as proof of efficacy, that most doctors now take an oath not just to heal, but to do no harm, that patients now have rights, voices, and options, that we can name our traumas, that we can ask questions, that we can say no, and it leaves us with a story, a long, often painful story of how healing went wrong and how it can be made right. Not with perfection, but with intention, not with certainty, care, but with care. So tonight, if you close your eyes and drift to sleep, remembering strange devices, smoke-filled chambers or white coats with sharp tools, remember this: we have walked a hard road to get here. We carry the weight of errors, yes, but also the hope that each new day brings us closer to a gentler form of care, one that does not flinch from history, but learns from it. Because behind every so-called cure, There was always a human being, and they deserved better. If this story resonated, clue, with you, if it moved you, shocked you, or made you reflect, please consider liking this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts, or with a story from your own life or family history. And if you'd like more cinematic, emotionally driven storytelling that explores the darkest corners of the past, make sure to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next story. In the end, the lobotomy wasn't about healing. It was about obedience. It was a weapon disguised as mercy. And though the procedure has faded, its legacy has not. Today, we still wrestle with the ethics of altering minds, of silencing pain, of choosing peace over personality. The story of the lobotomy is not a medical footnote, it is a warning that even in white coats and clean rooms, horror can wear the mask of help, and sometimes, the scalpel doesn't just cut into the brain, it cuts into the soul. The blade gleamed with purpose, its edge thin as truth, its history long as the grief it left behind. In the stillness of a medieval chamber, a man lay trembling, not from his affliction, but from the knowledge that the cure had arrived. He had a fever, a racing heart, perhaps a cough. But none of that mattered. The barber surgeon was here, and that meant only one thing: the blood must come out. For over 2,000 years, humanity was seduced by one of the most enduring medical myths in history, that the body could be healed through the release of its own lifeblood. It began with the Greeks. Hippocrates and Galen, titans of ancient medicine, believed the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, they said, was the result of imbalance, and the most dominant, most dangerous humor of all was blood. Too much blood, you'd become feverish, aggressive, anxious. The solution was obvious: drain it out. But this was no metaphor. Galen's teachings spread through the Roman Empire like scripture. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, his words were treated as divine law. Doctors were revered, not for innovation, but for adherence to ancient doctrine. And so bloodletting became the standard, not a fringe idea, but the core of Western medicine. It was performed with knives, lancets, glass cups, and even leeches. Tools varied, but the principle remained. If a patient was sick, cut them open. Barber surgeons, who doubled as hairdressers and physicians, became the unsung grim reapers of their time. Their poles red, white, and spiraling, the bandages soaked with blood. You can still see those poles today. But the horror they represent has been forgotten. A noblewoman with a headache might find herself bled from the neck. A farmer with pneumonia would be opened at the wrist. Child with a fever, the heel, the ankle, the temple, anywhere a vein could be found. And the more severe the symptoms, the more blood they took. There was no dosage, no limit. Some patients had pints removed at once. Others were bled daily until they collapsed. The body, already weak from disease, would now be forced to survive not only the sickness but the loss of its very essence. And it wasn't just the poor who suffered. Kings, popes, emperors all bled. George Washington, the first president of the United States, fell ill with a sore throat one winter evening in 1799. By morning, he had been bled 4 times, losing over 40% of his blood volume. He died. That evening not from the illness, but from the treatment. His physicians stood over his lifeless body, uncertain. They had done everything right, according to the knowledge of the time, which is to say, they had done everything wrong, but bloodletting persisted not, because it worked, but because it was ritual. It looked like healing. It felt like action. The patient winced, the blood spilled, and the doctor wiped his hands with the confidence of a man who had done his part. No one questioned whether the patient actually got better, because so often they didn't. And yet, doctors clung to the practice, even into the 19th century, well after microscopes had revealed the complexity of the body. Bloodletting was still considered respectable. Parisian hospitals kept charts of how much blood had been drained from each patient, liters, measured with pride. In Britain, some hospitals demanded at least one bleeding session per patient upon admittance, regardless of the diagnosis. But then came the whispers. Rebels like Pierre, Charles, Alexander, Louis, a French physician, began to count the dead. He studied hundreds of patients treated for pneumonia with bloodletting and compared them to those who weren't. The results were shocking. Those who were bled died more often. The medical establishment turned on him. How dare you question centuries of practice? But the numbers did not lie. Slowly, reluctantly, the world began to listen. By the mid-1800s, the age of reason was clawing its way back into medicine. Germ theory was dawning. The microscope had given science a new lens. The scalpel was losing ground to sanitation. And the lancet, the symbol of centuries of bleeding, was finally laid to rest, but not without scars. Entire generations had suffered, hands of good intentions wrapped in ignorance. Mothers bled after childbirth. Soldiers bled on the battlefield and again in the hospital. Children with colds were made to faint from blood loss. Thousands, millions, perhaps, had died needlessly. The tragedy of bloodletting was not just in its cruelty, it was in its logic, because it made sense. When someone is flushed, sweating, burning with fever, the idea of reducing their blood seems intuitive. The mistake was thinking that symptoms were the enemy, not signals, not cries for help. Medicine, in its arrogance, had silenced the body instead of listening to it, and in doing so, it nearly drowned the future in blood. What's worse, the legacy of bloodletting lingers in strange echoes. Modern detox culture, with its cleanses and purges, still appeals to that ancient instinct to purge the poison, to cut away the sickness. Even now, in the 21st century, some alternative therapies advocate for wet cupping, a practice that mimics bloodletting, with suction and incisions. But healing does not come from taking something out. True healing comes from understanding what is already within. We look back at bloodletting, now with horror, we must remember, those who practiced it were not evil. They were trying to help. They were following the best knowledge they had. And that's what makes the story so terrifying, because it wasn't a villain with a blade. It was your family, Dr. Your trusted healer, smiling as he opened your vein and told you it was for your own good. They believed the body was a temple, but one defiled from within. See, a vessel polluted by unseen demons, spoiled food, or moral corruption. If the body ached, if the mind unraveled, it was because something inside had turned rotten. and so it had to be expelled, not soothed, not healed. Expelled by force, by fire, by the sheer will of medicine. In this world, health meant emptiness, and the more violently that emptiness was achieved, the closer you came to salvation. This was the age of purging. For centuries, from Renaissance palaces to the humblest cottages, doctors and healers prescribed vomiting and diarrhea not as side effects, but as the very goal of treatment. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't gentle. It was violent, humiliating, and often deadly. And yet, it was embraced with fervor. The logic was deceptively simple. Illness, they believed, was caused by toxins trapped inside the body. These poisons needed to be expelled through any orifice available. The stomach, the bowels, the mouth, the sweat glands, cleanse the filth, and the body would be reborn. It didn't matter what you were suffering from: headache, vomit, fever, purge, melancholy, enema, grief. Fast until the tears turned to bile, then vomit that, too. A young servant named Elise, working in the house of a French nobleman in 1726, learned this truth the hard way. When her master's daughter fell ill with fatigue and pale skin, the family physician diagnosed blocked humors. He ordered repeated vomiting, induced with antimony, a metallic potion laced with toxic compounds. The girl screamed. Her lips turned blue. She convulsed. But the physician smiled. The sickness is leaving her. The sickness was leaving, yes, along with her electrolytes, her blood pressure, her very ability to stand. She died 2 days later. The physician left a note in his ledger. Treatment successful. Patient expired before full recovery. The phrase became so common, it was almost a joke. Patients didn't die from illness. They died before the cure could take effect. But the truth was far darker. These purgatives, known as emetics, laxatives, and enemas, were not mild substances. They were chemical weapons, crude and untested. Calomel, a mercury-based compound, was one of the most popular. It stripped the lining of the intestines like acid. Tartrate of antimony would make you vomit until your throat bled. Jalap root, scammony, sanethes were used in punishing doses, intended to make the patient feel as close to death as possible without actually crossing over. Except, of course, many did. Children, the elderly, and the already frail were especially vulnerable. Diarrhea would cause dehydration. Vomiting would lead to choking, muscle spasms, and dangerous electrolyte imbalances long before those terms were even understood. But doctors weren't watching for that. They were watching the stool, the vomit, the color, the volume. Some believed that if bile was yellow, the cure was near. If black, the soul was purging sin. There are reports of 18th century hospitals keeping stools in glass jars as evidence of successful treatments, little trophies of intestinal warfare. Then there were the enemas. They weren't private, they weren't discreet. They were ceremonial. In the French court of Louis XIV, enemas were so normalized that the king reportedly received over 2,000 of them during his reign, many of them administered publicly, as courtiers discussed matters state, while a physician inserted a metal syringe into the royal rectum. The belief was simple. Clean bowels made a clean mind. Kings, queens, bishops. and scholars all embraced enemas as a form of both medical treatment and spiritual hygiene. But among the poor, the ritual was not so refined. Metal tubes, pig bladder pumps, soap, salt water, hot oils, anything to force the body to empty itself. Children screamed, women fainted, men defecated into buckets, unable to move from the pain. And after all that, the illness often remained, or grew worse, because these treatments didn't address the disease. They simply broke the body in hopes of chasing the ghost away. There was no standardization, no dosage, no warning labels. A physician might prescribe a strong purge without defining what that meant, and the apothecary might interpret it differently, sometimes disastrously. One famous case involved a woman in London in 1793 who was given a double dose of croton oilin, extremely toxic laxative derived from tree seeds, tea. Within hours, she had lost all muscle control. Her body seized, her intestines hemorrhaged. She died on the floor, clutching her abdomen in horror. The attending physician noted that her body had fully evacuated all humors, yet the vital flame failed to rekindle. He didn't consider the purge a failure, only incomplete, and therein lies the tragedy. This wasn't a fringe belief. This was mainstream medicine for over 500 years. The greatest minds of their era believed that to heal someone, you must first destroy their insides. Even into the 19th century, purging remained common practice. Soldiers were purged before battle, prisoners before sentencing, brides before their wedding night. Some schools even purged children weekly, believing it kept them obedient. It wasn't until modern pathology and the discovery of microbes that these ideas began to crumble. The real causes of illness, bacteria, viruses, inflammation, couldn't be vomited out or flushed away. But the purging rituals didn't vanish overnight. Even today, echoes remain. Cleanse your colon, say the ads. Detox your liver, flush your system. Modern wellness culture is riddled with rebranded versions. Purge of ancient purging, juice cleanses, master fasts. Saltwater flushes all, driven by the same fear that something inside us is unclean, and only suffering can make us whole again. But the truth is, the body is not a toilet to be flushed. It is a living system, elegant and self-regulating. When it falls ill, it doesn't need violence. It needs understanding. There's a haunting story told in the back pages of a 1764 medical journal. A doctor named Reuben Hawthorne treated a young man named Daniel, age 17, who had fallen into a deep depression after the death of his sister. Pale, listless, without appetite, Daniel was diagnosed with melancholia brought by internal putrefaction. The treatment, a triple purgimetics, enemas, and fasting. The boy didn't speak for a week. Then he began vomiting uncontrollably. The following day, he defecated blood. He died that night. Dr. Hawthorne's notes read, "An unfortunate outcome. Perhaps another purge could have reversed the decline." No mention of the sister. No mention of grief. Just the obsession with emptying out a boy already hollowed by sorrow. It's easy to look back with disgust, but what we must remember is this. They weren't trying to hurt people. They were trying to help, using the tools they had, the beliefs they were handed. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because how many of our current treatments will seem monstrous in hindsight. How many of our modern cures are simply echoes of old violence wrapped in new packaging? Medicine is a mirror. It shows us what we value. And for centuries, we valued purity over compassion, cleansing over listening, pain over presence, and sometimes we still do. There was a time when death wore rouged, it powdered its face in lead and shimmered with arsenic. It smelled faintly of violets, laced with mercury and the metallic sting of slow decay. And people adored it, because to be pale, to be radiant, to be ghost-like, that was to be beautiful. That was to be healthy. That was to be loved. But what no one said aloud, what many refused to believe, even as they wasted away, was that this beauty was killing them. In the 18th and 19th centuries, across the drawing rooms of Vienna and the salons of Paris, a disturbing fashion took hold. Pale skin became the highest standard of elegance. It meant you did not toil in the sun. It meant you were wealthy, refined, above manual labor. It meant you were untouched by the outside world. And so men and women, particularly women, turned to powders and creams to lighten their skin. They applied them daily, sometimes hourly. They never questioned what was in them. One of the most popular cosmetics of the era was Venetian ceruse, a thick white paste made of white lettuce, ladonned vinegar. It created an ethereal, porcelain complexion. It also caused skin erosion, tooth decay, hair loss, tremors, brain damage, and eventually death. But it worked. And that was all that mattered. There are letters, diaries, entire books from the time filled with gentle advice from one woman to another. Apply sparingly around the eyes to avoid swelling. Should the skin begin to peel, use rose water and continue application. Do not fear the graying of the gums. This is but a sign of the product's strength. They knew, deep down, they knew something was wrong. But vanity and social pressure were powerful poisons too. And by the time the symptoms appeared, it was often too late. Margarethe von Klein, a once celebrated socialite in Berlin, was known for her porcelain face and silver blonde hair. By 30, she could no longer speak clearly. Her fingers trembled. Her cheeks, once smooth and bright, began to flake and crack. Her gums blackened. But she continued to wear the ceruse, even on her deathbed, when she passed. Her maid described her final breath as soft, silent, and beautiful, like a powder settling on the floor. Cosmetics weren't the only source of slow death. In the Victorian era, arsenic became the miracle element. It was in everything: tonic water, soap, wallpaper, paint, children's toys, fabric dye, and most ironically in medicine, doctors prescribed arsenic to treat syphilis, skin disorders, anemia, and even as a general pick-me-up. Arsenic pills were marketed to women as beauty supplements to brighten the eyes and smooth the skin. And in a way, they worked. Arsenic constricted blood vessels, giving the appearance of a youthful flush. It lightened complexions. It killed bacteria. It also destroyed red blood cells, interfered with metabolism, caused organ failure, and had a tendency to accumulate in the body until it reached catastrophic levels. But the effects were slow. That's what made it so seductive. A young woman named Alice Thorne, living in a cramped tenement in London's East End in 1874. Began taking arsenic wafers to keep up appearances after her mother's death. Her job as a seamstress exposed, too, her too little son, and the pallor made her look more respectable to clients. Within 2 years, her skin was riddled with sores, her hair fell out. But the real agony came later, when her liver began to fail. No one connected the dots until her cousin, who had used the same product, died with the same symptoms. Even in the face of multiple deaths, advertisements continued to promote arsenic as safe, effective, and fashionable. One famous product doctor, Campbell's arsenic complexion wafers, claimed to purify the blood, eradicate blemishes, and endow the user with a divine appearance. It was endorsed by actresses and noblewomen, and sold by the thousands. No regulations, no testing, just blind trust. And then there was mercury. Today, cooey. We think of mercury as a metallic liquid locked inside thermometers, but in earlier centuries, it was considered medicine's sharpest blade, a cure for madness, syphilis, constipation, toothaches, and melancholia. The most infamous mercury compound was calomel, a chalky white powder often given to children in dangerously high doses. It caused violent purging, profuse sweating, and eventually led to mercury poisoning, known as salivation, because the patient would begin drooling uncontrollably as their gums dissolved and their teeth fell out. In the American South, calomel was handed out like candy. Plantation doctors used it on enslaved people, often in horrific doses, believing it cleared the body of African ailments. White families used it, 2 mothers forcing it into the mouths of crying babies, convinced it would bring them strength. There are documented cases of entire families experiencing mercury poisoning, unable to connect the foaming mouths and hallucinations to the medicine they trusted. Even famed historical figures weren't immune. Napoleon was given mercury treatments for stomach ailments. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, was a devoted calomel user, so much so that many of his patients accused him of causing more harm than the diseases he tried to treat. But no one rivaled the horrors inflicted on those treated for syphilis. Before antibiotics, syphilis was a long, torturous sentence. Doctors had little to offer, so they turned to mercury, inhaled as vapor, rubbed into the skin, injected directly into the body. The phrase, "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," became a bitter medical joke. The treatment was worse than the disease. Patients lost teeth, their bones ached, their minds broke, and worst of all, the mercury often didn't cure the syphilis, it just masked the symptoms, allowing the disease to spread quietly until the body collapsed. One tragic case involved a man named Elijah, an artist in 1820s New York, who was infected by a brothel worker. He spent 3 years in treatment, his skin blistering from mercury rubs. He painted feverishly, trying to leave behind something before his inevitable end. When he died, his final piece was found, an oil portrait of a woman whose face was dissolving into smoke. Death by beauty, death by medicine, death by trust. The scariest part of these stories isn't the toxins themselves, it's how normal they seemed, how respected, how routine. Because if a doctor gave it, if a noble woman endorsed it, if the results were visible, then it must have been right. And here lies the quiet horror. Most of the suffering was invisible. There were no loud screams, no overt warnings, just pale skin, then paler, a headache that wouldn't leave, gums that began to ache, a heart that slowed, and then one morning, the body simply gave out, all in the name of elegance. Even into the early 20th century, this obsession continued. Radium and other radioactive killer was marketed in tonics and beauty creams. Women painted it on their nails, their lips, their teeth. It glowed, it dazzled, it killed. The radium girls, factory workers who painted watch dials with luminous radium paint, were instructed to point their brushes with their lips, licking them into shape. They glowed in the dark. They were envied, until their jaws disintegrated and tumors bloomed inside their skulls. Only then did the public begin to understand beauty can be a weapon, especially when it's wielded by the hands of the trusted. Today, we live in a world where regulation exists, where mercury, lead, and arsenic are banned from cosmetics. But vanity, like history, finds a way to repeat itself. The modern wellness industry still markets detox teas, appetite suppressants, and bleaching creams in beautiful packaging, endorsed by influencers and sold under the guise of some. Poisons are different. The message is the same. Transform your body, erase your flaws, become someone worthy of admiration. We no longer dip our faces in lead, but we inject them with chemicals we barely understand. We no longer swallow arsenic pills, but we take weight loss drugs that destroy our hearts. We no longer inhale mercury, but we inhale toxic ideals, crafted by corporations that profit from our self-doubt, because that's the real sickness, not just in the body, but in the culture. We believed beauty was worth dying for, and we still do. But the body remembers. The body keeps score. The screaming never stopped. Not in the morning, not at night, not in winter, when the frost crept across the barred windows, or in summer, when the sun beat mercilessly on the iron roofs and the walls dripped with sweat and mildew. Inside the asylum, time did not pass. It merely hovered thick, sour, and rotting like the breath of a dying god. And in that place, once you were admitted, the only thing that separated you from death was the imagination of the doctors. Some of them believed they were helping, others knew better, and simply didn't care. But for those locked within the padded rooms of the 19th century asylum, the line between help and horror was never clear. They came in different ways. A husband who wanted a quieter wife. A father, ashamed of his daughter's melancholy. A community eager to remove the man who talked to himself in the alley. Once you were inside, you were no longer a person. You were a case, a file, a living experiment. The treatments, if one could call them, that were designed not to heal, but to control. Madness, in the eyes of the early psychiatric field, was not an affliction to be understood, but a defect to be crushed out of the human spirit, like air from a dying lung. The chair was one of the first tools they used. Straitjackets, heavy bindings, sometimes even chains, were wrapped tightly around the patient's body, and they were secured to what was called a tranquilizer chair. The idea was simple: immobilize the body to calm the mind. But the effect was anything but peaceful. Imagine sitting for hours or days unable to move a muscle, blood pooling in your limbs, joints swelling with agony, your own urine soaking into the seat beneath you because you are not allowed to stand, because movement meant rebellion, because stillness meant obedience. One man, George Ellison, a railroad worker institutionalized after a series of violent outbursts, was left in the chair for 72 hours. When they finally removed the straps, his arms had turned purple. His wrists had deep, infected sores. He never walked properly again, but he didn't scream anymore. To the doctors, this was success. And then there was the rotating chair. It looked almost playful, like something found in a fairground, but it was not made for laughter. Patients were strapped in and spun at high speeds, sometimes for an hour at a time, until they vomited or passed out. The theory that spinning the fluids of the inner ear might restore mental balance. It didn't. It only terrified. It only humiliated. It only broke what was left of a person's sense of reality. Dr. Benjamin Rush, celebrated as the father of American psychiatry, was a strong advocate of this technique. He also believed that insanity was caused by excess blood flow to the brain. His solution: bloodletting veins were opened. Pints of blood were drained. In some cases, patients were bled until they lost consciousness. And, if they died, it was considered evidence they were too far gone to be saved. But perhaps the most nightmarish treatment was the cold water cure. This involved plunging patients into ice-cold baths, sometimes for hours, or wrapping them in soaked, freezing sheets, and restraining them on tables until they stopped convulsing or sobbing. The shock, doctors claimed, could snap the mind back to clarity. For a woman named Claire Denslow, committed at age 26 for hysterical delusions after the death of her infant son, the cold water cure was her daily punishment. Every open morning she screamed when the nurses came for her. Every morning they dragged her from her cot, stripped her, and dunked her into the water. Some days, she didn't even have the energy to cry. She just stared hollow-eyed, waiting for it to end. Her delusions never returned, but neither did her voice. The methods varied by country, by facility, by the personal quirks of the overseeing doctor. In France, spinning wheels and bloodletting were paired with enforced silence. In England, patients were beaten for speaking out of turn. In the United States, shock therapy became a favorite by the early 20th century. Electroconvulsive therapy, now practiced with anesthesia and care, was once a brutal affair. Electrodes were attached to the skull. A jolt of electricity was delivered. With no warning, no sedation, and no understanding of long-term effects. Bodies seized, teeth shattered from clenched jaws, backs arched, and eyes rolled back. The first time it was administered to a patient named Leo Grant. He broke his own nose during the convulsion. The nurses stuffed gauze in his mouth for the next session, as if that might stop the damage. It didn't. But the hospital director noted improvement in his behavior. He had grown docile, compliant, afraid. Success, and still it continued. There were more modern nightmares too. In the 1940s and 50s, the lobotomy was hailed as a miracle cure. It began with drilling into the skull to sever neural pathways thought to cause unwanted thoughts. But that required skill. So one man, Dr. Walter Freeman's ought a more efficient approach. His solution, an ice pick. He would slide a sharp metal rod through the eye socket, wiggle it to cut the brain's frontal lobe connections, and call it a day. Sometimes he performed them in his office, sometimes on stage at medical conferences, sometimes on children. Rosemary Kennedy, sister of U.S. President John F. Kennedy, was one of his victims. At 23, she was subjected to a lobotomy for mood swings and rebelliousness. When it was over, she was left with the cognitive function of a toddler. She spent the rest of her life in institutional care. But Dr. Freeman performed thousands more, convinced he was saving lives for those left behind in the wards. The real sickness became not the one that brought them there, but the one inflicted upon them inside and outside. The world looked away. Families whispered. Neighbors changed the subject. Reporters were paid off. It was easier not to know. One nurse, years later, confessed in a letter. We tied them down and called it care. We silenced them and called it peace. We hurt them over and over and told ourselves we were doing the right thing. But at night, in the dark, we heard them cry like children, and we knew. But not all patients lost themselves. There were moments rare, fleeting, but unforgettable, when someone managed to hold on. Amelia Whitehall, admitted at 16 for moral insanity after running away with a sailor, endured 3 years stewed of restraints, ice baths, and silence. But in secret, she carved stories into the wood beneath her bed. Tales of escape, of flight, of a girl who became a bird and flew over the asylum walls. Decades later, when the facility was condemned, workers found the boards. Her carvings were still there. A whole universe hidden in the dark. And now, looking back, the question that lingers is not how this happened. It's why it was allowed, because mental illness has always frightened society, not just because it's misunderstood but because it reflects the fragility of the mind we depend on to define ourselves. When someone speaks to shadows or breaks from reality, it's easier to lock them away than to admit. We might one day join them, so we created dungeons and called them hospitals. We created punishments and called them therapies. We created silence and called it mercy. And in that silence, so many were lost. Today, we recognize the failures of early psychiatry. We understand trauma. We offer medication with informed consent. We advocate for therapy, for community, for dignity. But the shadow remains, in the stigma, in the shame, in the idea that madness is something to be hidden, feared, or erased. The ghosts of those screaming halls still echo in the institutions of today. And we must listen, because the past does not disappear. It only waits for forgetfulness. And in places where the screaming has stopped, sometimes the silence is even worse. The door clicked open with a softness that belied what lay inside. Beyond it, a chamber perfectly sterile, eerily quiet, and bathed in a dull amber light stood waiting. There were no screams here, no restraints, no stench of sweat and terror. Just a metal table, a polished tray, and a smell, antiseptic and something else, ozone perhaps, or fear, bleached so clean it had no voice left. This was not a medieval dungeon. It was a medical theater in early 20th century Vienna, and on that table, Anna Morgenstern lay very still. She was only 22, but her body bore the weariness, of someone twice that. For years, Anna had suffered from hysteria, the diagnosis used for anything unexplainable in a woman: panic, grief, melancholy, rebellion, sexual desire. She had already endured the baths, the restraints, the talking, cure that left her more hollow than healed. But her final prescription was different. This time, it was surgical. This time, they would cut the madness out of her. Dr. Hilbricht stood over her, a man praised for his precision and composure. His assistants stood by, hands gloved, eyes fixed. They were not removing a tumor. They were performing a clitoridectomy. It sounds unfathomable now, barbaric, unthinkable. But in that room, and in many others across Europe and North America, doctors believed female hysteria could be cured by removing the parts of the body they believed made women irrational, their sexual organs. The logic was grotesque in its simplicity. Women were unstable because of their anatomy. Remove it, and you remove the problem. The procedure was brutal and deeply invasive. Without anesthesia in the early days, women were often awake and restrained, their cries ignored. Later, when chloroform became common, it was used liberally, but only to keep them still, not to shield them from what came after. Recovery was long. Infection was common. Many women never walked properly again. Some died. But the operation persisted for decades, disguised as progress, paraded as science. And this wasn't the only place where medicine blurred into mutilation. In 19th century Britain, another terrifying practice rose in popularity under the guise of moral hygiene: the forced sterilization of the mentally ill, poor, and undesirable. Eugenics was not born in Nazi Germany. Its roots dug much deeper into the hands of well-dressed physicians and progressive thinkers who believed they were protecting the future of mankind. In the United States, these ideas became law. By 1927, the Supreme Court had ruled in Buck v. Bell that sterilizing a woman without her consent was not only legal, it was for the public good. The woman in question, Carrie Buck, had been institutionalized for being feeble-minded. In truth, she was a normal girl, raped by her foster family and discarded to avoid scandal. But in court, she became a symbol of degeneration. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The procedure took less than an hour. It destroyed her ability to bear children forever. Carrie was only the beginning. Tens of thousands of people, across the U.S. and many more globally, were sterilized without consent in the following decades. Men and women, often poor, disabled, or simply inconvenient, were targeted by governments under the banners of science and progress. They were told it was for their health, for their future. Some weren't told at all. In California, nurses quietly tied women's tubes during unrelated surgeries. In Virginia, entire families were rounded up. In Sweden, the policy continued until the mid-1970s. Some victims were as young as 12. Others never knew they had been sterilized until they tried to start families of their own. By then, it was too late. And always, behind these acts, was same belief. that the imperfect could be corrected with a blade. The further you dig into medical history, the more this pattern repeats. The human body, treated as an object, a puzzle to be fixed with force and fire. The soul forgotten, the dignity erased. In Renaissance Italy, there was a boy named Matteo. At 13, his voice changed, his body shifted, his choir director desperate to preserve the boy's angelic singing voice, ordered a castration. This wasn't rare. It was part of a widespread practice. Castrati. Boys were gelded before puberty so their vocal cords would never mature. The result? Ethereal, impossible voices that filled opera houses and cathedrals across Europe. The pain was unimaginable. The trauma, deeper still. But the world applauded. The Vatican endorsed it. And the doctors performing the procedures called it musical medicine. Matteo survived. His voice was beautiful. He became famous. But in private, he never smiled. He avoided mirrors. He wrote letters to no one, filled with lines like, "I sing, and the world weeps, but I cannot feel the sound." There were other cures, of course, all with names meant to sound gentle: therapies, regimens, restoratives, but the reality was often far from kind. Take mercury. For centuries, it was hailed as a miracle, used to treat everything from skin infections to syphilis. Mercury was applied to open wounds, rubbed into the gums, or injected directly into the bloodstream. Its side effects, tremors, blindness, madness, death, were dismissed as part of the healing process. Thomas Harrow, a merchant in 18th century London, was diagnosed with venereal disease. He was given a mercury regimen, daily rubs, vapor inhalation, and doses in his wine. Within weeks, he couldn't hold a pen. His tongue swelled so large he could no longer eat. His gums turned black, but the physician noted that the disease had ceased to progress. Thomas died 4 days later. The treatment was deemed a success. Leeches followed a similar path, bleeding again and again for conditions that had nothing to do with blood. Fevers, headaches, melancholy, all treated with blood loss. Women bled for menstrual pain. Children bled for night terrors. Sometimes infants were given tiny incisions behind the ears to release pressure. In one hospital, a girl was bled 12 times in 1 week. She died on the 13th. Her case was recorded in neat cursive. There was no note of sorrow, but perhaps the most haunting treatment wasn't one involving knives or flames but silence.